David King walked into the glass-walled conference room as if he owned the place, which, technically, he still did. Or so he thought. His tailored suit hung perfectly on his lean frame, and the subtle click of his polished shoes on the marble floor announced his arrival with authority. The board members inside the room immediately fell silent, their chatter evaporating like steam under his withering presence. David gave them a curt nod, lips curling into a practiced, self-satisfied smile. "Let's make this quick," David announced, glancing at the sleek platinum watch hugging his wrist. "Time is money, and we've got a lot of both riding on today." A few executives chuckled nervously, eager to stay on his good side. But Elijah Monroe, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, didn't so much as twitch. He sat with his hands folded neatly in front of him, shoulders relaxed, his expression calm but unreadable, as if he had nothing to prove. David's sharp blue eyes flicked briefly toward Elijah, and a flicker of annoyance surfaced. "Who's this guy again?" "Oh, right, some representative from a startup trying to pitch a partnership with David's corporation." David resisted the urge to roll his eyes. These kinds of meetings were usually a waste of time. Small-time businessmen looking for handouts. They came in with flashy presentations, hoping to catch the attention of someone like David King. But David already knew how this would end. He'd humor the man, sit through his presentation, and then politely, or not, show him the door. After all, what did someone like him know about business at this level? David took his seat at the head of the table and leaned back, exuding the confidence of a man who had never been told no. With one hand, he adjusted the cuff of his jacket, then gestured toward Elijah with a casual wave. "All right," David said, his voice carrying just enough condescension to sting. "Let's see what you've got." Elijah nodded, expression unchanged, and quietly opened the sleek leather folder in front of him. He slid a tablet onto the table and connected it to the projector with quick, efficient movements. No wasted gestures, no flash or theatrics, just business. A sleek logo appeared on the screen, followed by financial charts and carefully worded projections. Elijah's voice was steady, calm, and precise as he began his pitch. "Thank you for your time, gentlemen. Today, I want to present an opportunity that will not only benefit your company but position you as leaders in sustainable growth for the future." David suppressed a yawn, already bored. Blah, blah, sustainable growth, heard it all before. But there was something about Elijah's demeanor that bothered him. The man was too calm, too composed. He wasn't sweating, wasn't trying to impress anyone. Elijah spoke as if he belonged here, and that rubbed David the wrong way. 5 minutes into the presentation, David leaned forward, propping his elbow on the table. He tapped a pen lazily against the smooth surface, smirking. "So, let me get this straight," David interrupted, cutting Elijah off mid-sentence. "You're telling us that your little company is somehow going to transform our business? That's a bold pitch." Some of the other executives chuckled, though their laughter was tinged with discomfort. Elijah remained unflappable. He gave a polite, measured nod. "I understand it may seem ambitious," Elijah said calmly, "but the numbers speak for themselves." David's smirk widened. "Ambition is one thing, Mr. Monroe. Reality is another. And reality is, companies like yours don't usually make it this far." A quiet hush fell over the room. The insult wasn't subtle. It was a sharp, barbed jab cloaked in corporate language. A lesser man might have bristled, but Elijah merely smiled. "That's true," Elijah replied smoothly. "But times change, Mr. King, and companies that fail to adapt often find themselves left behind." The subtle rebuke was delivered with such calm precision that it took a moment for the weight of the words to land. David's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, masking his irritation with a dismissive shrug. "Interesting perspective," David said coolly, though his jaw tightened. "Let's see if your numbers are as bold as your words." Elijah clicked to the next slide, revealing a series of projections that made even the most skeptical executives sit up a little straighter. He spoke with confidence, outlining the benefits of the proposed partnership without a single wasted word. David hated every second of it. Who does this guy think he is? The other executives began murmuring among themselves, clearly impressed by Elijah's proposal. Even David's second-in-command, Sam, gave a small nod of approval. David felt a surge of irritation. He wasn't used to losing control of the room. "So," David interrupted again, his tone sharper this time, "what makes you think your operation belongs at this table? Let's be honest. You're a bit out of your league here, don't you think?" Another ripple of nervous laughter spread across the room, but Elijah didn't flinch. "With all due respect, Mr. King," Elijah said, "I believe the numbers speak for themselves. And, if I may add, this isn't just a proposal, it's an opportunity." David arched an eyebrow. "Opportunity for whom? You or us?" Elijah's eyes locked with David's, calm and unwavering. "Both." The tension in the room was almost palpable now. David could feel it pressing down on him, thick and suffocating. But Elijah remained unbothered, sitting as still as a stone, exuding quiet confidence. David leaned back in his chair, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, Mr. Monroe," he said, dripping with sarcasm, "I think we've heard enough." Elijah nodded. "I thought you might say that." With deliberate calm, Elijah reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek, black folder. He slid it across the table toward David, who eyed it suspiciously. "What's this?" David asked, his voice laced with irritation. Elijah's smile was small but deliberate. "Just some additional information. I think you'll find it enlightening." David stared at the folder, his curiosity piqued despite himself. He reached for it slowly, flipping it open, and his smirk vanished in an instant. His eyes widened as he scanned the contents. Page after page, document after document, and every one of them told the same story. Elijah Monroe wasn't just a businessman. He was the majority owner of David's company. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the papers in front of him. The bold print on the top page confirmed the unthinkable. Elijah Monroe, majority shareholder. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped through each document, trying to grasp how this had happened under his nose. It was impossible. How could this be real? The room was silent, every executive frozen in place. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging wide-eyed glances. No one dared speak, waiting for David to break the silence. But for the first time in his life, David King was speechless. He closed the folder slowly, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. "This has to be some kind of mistake." Elijah remained perfectly composed, his hands resting calmly on the table. "No mistake, Mr. King. I've been acquiring shares over the last 3 years through various holding firms. It was strategic, intentional, and now I control the majority." David's stomach turned as the weight of Elijah's words sank in. This wasn't just a failed pitch. It was a hostile takeover, and he'd walked straight into it without even realizing. David leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table like a man clinging to the last bit of control he had left. How did no one know about this?" he stammered, looking desperately at the other executives, searching for someone to explain how this nightmare could have slipped past him. Elijah answered with calm precision. "Because you weren't paying attention. You didn't see me as a threat, and that's why this was easy." David's mouth went dry. He hated the way Elijah was speaking to him, not with arrogance, but with quiet certainty. It was the voice of someone who knew he'd already won. David's eyes flicked to his executives, hoping for support, but their faces told him everything he needed to know. They wouldn't back him. They were as shocked as he was, and some of them even seemed relieved. David straightened his shoulders, forcing himself to sit tall in his chair. "All right," he said, trying to sound calm even though his insides were in knots. "You've made your move. Now what? You think you can just waltz in here and take over my company?" Elijah didn't flinch. "It's not your company anymore. It's ours now." David's jaw tightened. He could feel the ground crumbling beneath him, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. "We can settle this," he said quickly. "We don't need to make this public. We can negotiate something." "There's no negotiation, David." Elijah's voice was steady but final. "This isn't about striking a deal. This is about setting things right." David's pulse quickened. Setting things right? The words hit him like a slap in the face. David felt like a trapped animal, his mind racing as he searched for a way out. He knew what would happen if this went public. His reputation would be destroyed. The media would paint him as an arrogant, outdated leader blindsided by a brilliant businessman he had underestimated. His gaze flickered back to Elijah. The man sitting across from him was calm, collected, and completely in control. David realized with dawning horror that he wasn't just dealing with a savvy businessman, he was dealing with someone who had planned every step of this meticulously. "You don't want to do this," David muttered, his voice low. "You have no idea what kind of backlash you'll get." Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained calm. "I'm not afraid of backlash. I've dealt with worse my whole life. This isn't about revenge, Mr. King. It's about leadership, and I intend to show you what real leadership looks like." The other executives sat on the edge of their seats, waiting for the final blow. But instead of issuing an ultimatum, Elijah leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "I'm giving you a choice," he said quietly. "You can step down gracefully, or you can stay. But if you stay, you'll do it under my leadership." David blinked, stunned. "You want me to stay?" "Yes," Elijah replied, "because the real work isn't just about taking control, it's about transforming it. And if you're willing to change, I believe there's still a place for you here." David stared at him, speechless. Elijah wasn't asking for power, he was offering redemption. It was the last thing David had expected, and it left him feeling more vulnerable than ever. David's mind raced. He could walk away now, salvage what little pride he had left, and disappear into obscurity. Or he could stay, and face the hardest challenge of his life. The room was silent, every eye on David, waiting for his answer. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized that for the first time in his life the decision wasn't his to make. It was Elijah's. And with that, the chapter ends, leaving the reader on the edge of their seat, eager to find out what David will choose. David sat motionless, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a vice. His instincts told him to walk out, preserve what little dignity he had left, and find another way to regain control. Some loophole, some legal maneuver. But deep down, he knew that Elijah had outmaneuvered him at every turn. There was no quick escape from this. The other executives sat in tense silence, waiting for David's response. He scanned their faces, hoping to find someone, anyone, who might offer a lifeline. But their expressions told him everything. They were already shifting their allegiance toward Elijah. David clenched his fists, frustration and humiliation burning in his chest. For years, he had been the one in charge, the man with all the answers. Now, in the span of a single meeting, everything had been ripped away from him. "I'll stay," David said finally, the words bitter on his tongue. It felt like swallowing shards of glass. "But don't think for a second I'm happy about it." Elijah's calm gaze didn't waver. "I don't need you to be happy about it, David. I just need you to be willing." The next day was the first in David's life where he wasn't the most powerful man in the room. He sat in his corner office, staring at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The same view he used to find exhilarating now felt suffocating. The first directive from Elijah arrived promptly at 8:20 a.m., a scheduled leadership meeting, one that David was no longer running, but merely attending. The email was brief and to the point. Agenda: Company Reformation and Inclusive Leadership Practices. Chair: Elijah Monroe. David sneered as he read the words. Inclusive leadership. What a joke, he thought bitterly. But he had no choice. He had agreed to stay, and now he had to play along, or risk total humiliation if Elijah exposed him to the public. David entered the boardroom. a place where he had always commanded respect, but now felt like a stranger. Elijah was already there, sitting at the head of the table, a spot David had occupied for nearly a decade. "Morning, everyone." Elijah greeted the room warmly, making eye contact with each executive. His tone wasn't forced or exaggerated, just calm and respectful. The atmosphere in the room was different. The tension that had once dominated David's meetings was gone, replaced by a cautious optimism. "We have a lot of work to do," Elijah began, "but I want to start by hearing your thoughts on where we've fallen short. No filters, just honesty." David stifled a groan. This is how he plans to lead? By playing nice? It seemed foolish to him. To his surprise, though, hands began to rise. Executives who had previously kept their thoughts to themselves started speaking freely, criticizing old policies, suggesting new directions, even admitting to their own mistakes. David sat back, feeling both irritated and confused. He had never encouraged this kind of open dialogue. To him, leadership was about control, not conversations. Elijah turned toward David. "What do you think, David? You've led this company for a long time. What's your take on where things went wrong?" David's jaw tightened. He wanted to lash out, to defend his legacy, but something in Elijah's gaze held him back. Not judgment, but expectation. After a long pause, David exhaled. "We've been too rigid," he admitted reluctantly. "We stuck with old strategies because they worked once, but I guess we didn't see the changes coming." The words felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else, but as soon as he said them, a strange sense of relief washed over him. Elijah nodded, as if David's admission was exactly what he had hoped for. "That's a good start." Over the next few weeks, David struggled to adjust. Elijah's leadership style was nothing like his own. Decisions were made collectively, meetings were collaborative, and employees, even the lowest-ranking ones, were encouraged to voice their opinions. It grated on David's nerves. He hated the chaos of it all, the unpredictability, the lack of hierarchy. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the results. Morale was improving. Productivity was rising, and, for the first time in years, the company felt alive. Still, every step forward felt like a step away from everything David had built. He wasn't sure how much more he could take. One afternoon, David found himself sitting alone in the employee break room, a place he had never bothered to visit before. He had come to escape the chaos of the office for a few minutes, but instead, he found himself watching employees chat and laugh over coffee. For the first time, David saw his staff not as cogs in a machine, but as people, real people with ideas, frustrations, and dreams. And he realized, with a pang of guilt, that he had never really known them. Elijah found him there a few minutes later. "It's different when you see them as people, isn't it?" he asked quietly, sitting down across from David. David didn't answer, but Elijah's words stayed with him long after the break room emptied. Despite the progress he was making, old habits were hard to break. One morning, during a tense strategy meeting, David snapped at a junior employee who suggested a risky but creative idea. "That's ridiculous," David barked. "We don't have time for childish experiments." The room fell silent. Elijah gave David a long, measured look. "We do have time," Elijah said calmly, "and we're going to make time." David felt the familiar surge of anger rising, but something stopped him, the realization that he was clinging to old patterns out of fear, not logic. Later that day, David sought out the employee he had snapped at. The apologizing wasn't something he was used to, but he forced the words out anyway. "I shouldn't have dismissed your idea," David said awkwardly. "It was creative. Keep thinking like that." The young employee looked stunned, but grateful. "Thank you, Mr. King," she said softly. As David walked away, he felt something strange, something he hadn't felt in years. It was small, but it was real. Pride. Not in himself, but in someone else. Days turned into weeks, and David found himself navigating the unfamiliar terrain of Elijah's leadership style. Every instinct told him to resist, to reassert control, to fall back on old habits. But the results of Elijah's methods were becoming harder to ignore. The company's atmosphere shifted. Employees seemed motivated, engaged, and, for the first time in a long while, genuinely happy. Meetings became dynamic spaces for collaboration, not just perfunctory gatherings where decisions were made top-down. David sat quietly in these meetings, absorbing the conversations, but struggling to let go of his rigid ways. He wasn't used to sharing power, and the process felt uncomfortable. One day, after a brainstorming session, David lingered as the employees filed out. Elijah stood by the door, watching David with his characteristic calm. "You did well today," Elijah said. David gave a curt nod, but inside, the compliment felt strange. Doing well? He wasn't sure what that even meant anymore. That night, David found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. For years, he had measured success by profit margins and market share, by how much control he could exert over every part of his company. But now, under Elijah's leadership, those measures seemed hollow. And it wasn't just the company that was changing, it was David himself. He remembered the early days of his career, when he was just another young executive trying to prove himself. Back then, the business world had seemed like a battlefield. He'd learned quickly that the only way to survive was to dominate, to climb the ladder no matter who he stepped on along the way. But somewhere along the line, survival had become something else. He had become the very kind of leader he used to despise, arrogant, dismissive, and disconnected. And now, for the first time, he wondered if it was too late to change. The next day, Elijah handed David a difficult task. "I want you to lead the team through the implementation of the new strategy," Elijah said, "and this time, let them lead the conversation." David stared at Elijah, stunned. "You want me to let them lead?" Elijah smiled. "Exactly." David's stomach churned. It was one thing to sit back during meetings, but handing control to his employees was something else entirely. As the meeting began, David sat at the head of the table, gripping the edges of his chair. One by one, the team members shared their ideas, discussing risks and opportunities with energy and enthusiasm. David fought the urge to interrupt, to assert control. He bit his tongue every time he wanted to steer the conversation back to his comfort zone. And slowly, he began to realize something. The less he spoke, the more his team flourished. The meeting ended with a clear, actionable plan, one David hadn't even needed to orchestrate. As the employees filed out, he sat quietly, stunned by the outcome. Elijah approached, placing a hand on David's shoulder. "See, leadership isn't about doing everything yourself. It's about trusting others to rise to the occasion." David gave a small, reluctant nod. He still wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea, but he couldn't deny the results. His team had done something remarkable, and for the first time it felt good not to have all the answers. That evening, Elijah invited David to dinner at a quiet restaurant near the office. Over wine and conversation, Elijah shared stories from his own journey, how he had faced countless rejections, endured insults, and fought for every opportunity. "I learned the hard way that success isn't just about winning," Elijah said. "It's about building something that lasts, and that means empowering others." David listened intently, realizing that Elijah's words held a truth he had avoided for too long. "I'm not asking you to change overnight," Elijah continued, "but I need you to be honest with yourself about why you resist this change. If you want to grow, you have to let go." The challenge hung in the air between them, as heavy as the silence that followed. The next morning, David sat at his desk, Elijah's words echoing in his mind. "If you want to grow, you have to let go." He opened an email from his brother, one of his last remaining allies from his old life. The message was short but pointed. "You're making a mistake, David. This new guy is going to ruin everything you built. Get out while you still can." David stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the pull of his past. Part of him wanted to walk away, to reclaim the control he had lost, but another part, the part that had begun to change, knew that walking away would be the easy way out, and David King had never been one to take the easy way out. Determined to push through his discomfort, David joined another meeting with his team. This time, he made a conscious effort to listen, to really listen. When one of the employees hesitated to share an idea, David surprised himself by encouraging her. "Go on," he said gently. "I want to hear it." The idea sparked a lively discussion, and once again, the team developed a solution without David needing to take control. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. For the first time in years, David felt like he was becoming a part of something larger than himself. After the meeting, David sat in his office, reflecting on how far he had come in just a few short weeks. It wasn't easy. Change never was. But for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could learn to lead differently. Elijah knocked on the door, stepping inside with a small smile. "You did good today," he said. David gave a faint smile in return. "Thanks, I'm trying." "That's all I ask," Elijah replied, and with that, David knew he was on the right path. Of course, the road to transformation was anything but smooth. There were still moments when David slipped back into old habits, when his pride got the better of him and he lashed out in frustration. But each time, Elijah was there to guide him back, not with harsh criticism, but with patience and understanding. "It's a process," Elijah reminded him, "and you're making progress." David wasn't sure if he believed it yet, but he was beginning to trust that maybe, just maybe, he was capable of becoming the leader he had always wanted to be. Months passed, and the changes in David and the company became undeniable. The toxic culture that had once defined the business was replaced with one of collaboration, respect, and innovation. And through it all, David discovered something he never expected: peace. He no longer felt the need to control everything. He no longer measured success by how much power he held. Instead, he found fulfillment in watching others succeed, in being part of a team rather than standing above it. For the first time in a long time, David King felt truly alive. David's transformation wasn't without challenges, but as the months passed, he felt more comfortable in his new role. His relationships with his employees deepened, and the company thrived under the collaborative environment Elijah had fostered. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. During a public event promoting the company's new diversity initiative, David spotted a familiar face in the crowd. Jake, his estranged brother. Jake had been one of David's last allies from his old life, the one who had warned him to resist Elijah's leadership. Seeing him now, standing at the edge of the event with a scowl, made David's stomach twist with unease. "Jake?" David called, walking toward him. Jake folded his arms, his expression hardened. "So, it's true," he said bitterly. "You've gone soft." David exhaled slowly, resisting the old urge to argue. "I've changed, Jake, and it's for the better." Jake scoffed. "Better for who? You sold out, David. You let him take everything from you." "No," David replied firmly. "I didn't lose anything. I gained something I never knew I needed." Jake shook his head in disbelief. "This isn't you, man. You were always the one in charge, the one calling the shots. Now you're working under some guy who—" David cut him off. "Who taught me how to be a better leader? Who showed me what it means to build something that lasts?" Jake's eyes narrowed. "You really believe that?" David nodded. "Yeah, I do. And I'm not going back to the way things were." For a moment, Jake looked as if he wanted to argue further, but then he shook his head, his face twisted with disappointment. "You've changed, David. I don't even know who you are anymore." David smiled softly. "I know who I am now, and that's enough." Not long after the reunion with his brother, a crisis struck the company. A competitor launched a smear campaign, accusing David's company of being weak under its new leadership. The attack was personal, targeting both David's reputation and the company's new direction under Elijah's guidance. Employees grew nervous, and the board began to panic. Old habits threatened to resurface as some executives suggested reverting to the company's previous rigid policies. David felt the familiar pressure building, the need to act, to take control. But this time, instead of acting impulsively, he turned to Elijah. "What do we do?" David asked, the words feeling strange but necessary. Elijah smiled. "We stick to the plan. We don't fight fire with fire. We fight it by staying true to who we are now." David took Elijah's words to heart. He called an emergency meeting with the entire staff, addressing them not as a CEO desperate to salvage his reputation, but as a leader invested in their shared future. "This attack is about more than just our business," David said, standing at the front of the room. "It's about fear of change, fear of progress. But we are not going back to the way things were. We've built something worth fighting for, and I know we can face this together." The room erupted in applause. For the first time, David felt the full weight of his transformation. He wasn't just a figurehead anymore, he was part of a team. The smear campaign lost momentum as David and Elijah stayed the course, focusing on transparency and trust. Their calm response earned the respect of clients and investors who saw the company's new leadership as a model of resilience. In the end, the competitors' attack backfired, further cementing David and Elijah's reputation as transformative leaders. Elijah approached David after the crisis subsided, clapping him on the shoulder. "You did good, David. I'm proud of you." David smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment that no amount of power or profit had ever given him. Months later, David and Elijah stood together at a press conference announcing a new initiative to support minority-owned businesses. The event marked the culmination of their shared vision, a company built not on dominance but on collaboration and growth. David looked out at the crowd, feeling a deep sense of pride, not in himself, but in what they had built together. "This company isn't just mine or Elijah's," David said. "It belongs to everyone who believes in what we're building, and together we're going to change the way business is done." After the press conference, David received an unexpected message from Jake. "Maybe I was wrong." The message read, "Maybe change isn't such a bad thing after all." David smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He knew he might never fully reconcile with his brother, but the message felt like a step in the right direction, a sign that even the most stubborn minds could change. As the company continued to thrive, David found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about the man he used to be, arrogant, rigid, and consumed by control, and he realized, with a quiet sense of peace, that he didn't miss that version of himself at all. He had learned that real leadership wasn't about power, it was about trust, collaboration, and the willingness to grow. And for the first time in his life, David felt truly free. Years later, as David prepared to step back from the day-to-day operations of the company, he felt nothing but gratitude. Elijah would carry the torch forward, leading the business into the future. "I couldn't have done this without you," David said to Elijah one evening. Elijah smiled. "You did the work, David. I just gave you the chance." David nodded, knowing that the real credit belonged to both of them, and to everyone who had believed in the new vision they had built together. In the final scene, David stood at the edge of the company's bustling office, watching as employees, diverse, motivated, and full of ideas, worked together toward a shared future. This was the legacy he had helped create. And as David walked away, leaving the company in capable hands, he knew that the best part of his journey was just beginning. For the first time in his life, David King felt not just like a leader, but like a man who had finally found his place. David sat quietly in his office, soon to be someone else's, taking in the familiar view of the skyline one last time. The office felt different now, not because the furniture had changed, but because he had. This wasn't the same space where he had once ruled with an iron fist. It was now a place where ideas flourished and employees thrived under the leadership style Elijah had introduced, and David had reluctantly embraced. As he looked back on everything that had happened, the loss of control, the struggle to adapt, the quiet victories, David realized something. The man who had once walked into this office wouldn't have recognized the man sitting here today, and that was a good thing. At the final board meeting under David's tenure, Elijah stood at the front of the room, addressing the executives with the same calm authority that had become his trademark. We're here today not just to celebrate a transition, but to recognize the journey we've taken together, Elijah said. He turned toward David with a warm smile. And none of this would have been possible without David King. David nodded, standing to address the room. I fought this change at every step, he admitted. But what I've learned is that real leadership isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go. He turned to Elijah. And I couldn't be prouder to leave this company in your hands. The room erupted into applause, and for the first time, David didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like part of a team. On his last day at the office, David packed up his few personal belongings. No plaques or trophies, just a framed photograph of the team taken after they launched the company's new initiative. Elijah appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. Leaving quietly, huh? David smiled. That's the plan. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, then Elijah extended his hand. Thank you, David, for everything. David shook his hand firmly. No, thank you. As he walked out of the office for the last time, David felt lighter than he ever had before. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something new. Weeks later, David met his brother Jake for coffee. They hadn't spoken much since that tense encounter at the company event, but David was determined to close that chapter too. Look, David began, setting his coffee down. I know things have changed between us, but I want you to know I needed to change, and I'm glad I did. Jake studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I think I get that now. It wasn't an apology, but it was enough. Under Elijah's leadership, the company continued to grow, becoming a model for ethical business practices. David watched from the sidelines, proud of what they had built together. His legacy wasn't the profits he'd made. It was the people he had helped empower. One day, a young employee approached him at a public event. Mr. King, I just wanted to say, thank you. You helped create something special. David smiled, feeling the weight of those words settle warmly in his heart. No, he replied. We created something special. In the last scene, David takes a walk through the company's headquarters, now bustling with life and energy. Everywhere he looks, he sees people collaborating, sharing ideas, and thriving, something he never thought possible when he first built the business. As he steps out into the open air, a sense of peace washes over him. He's not the same man who started this journey, and he's okay with that. With a final glance back at the building, David smiles. He knows now that true success isn't about control. It's about growth, trust, and transformation. And for the first time in his life, David King feels free. Months later, David receives a letter from Elijah. David, I've kept your office just the way you left it. Come back anytime. The door is always open. David folds the letter carefully and places it on his desk at home. He knows he may not return to the office, but it's comforting to know that the door remains open, just as his heart now is. With a contented sigh, David pours himself a drink and leans back in his chair. His journey may be over, but a new chapter is just beginning. And this time, he's ready for whatever comes next. Thank you for watching this incredible journey of transformation. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more inspiring content that challenges the way we think about leadership, growth, and second chances. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you were in David's shoes? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next powerful story. And if you enjoyed this, share it with a friend who could use a reminder that change is always possible. Stay tuned for more, and let's keep the conversation going together.